How is all of this data that's being collected, particularly within personalized health, it's such personal data, how is that being protected? And where that obviously was another huge element of what you had to be responsible for with HIPAA and some of the privacy laws.
It sure is. I think anyone in healthcare has a burden and a responsibility to the patients and their privacy, and to obviously their employees and their privacy. I mean, security was an area, a decade ago we kind of stumbled into, particularly in healthcare. It wasn't an area that was focused on as it is today, and people weren't spending both the money and they weren't spending the resources on it. I made a promise very early on, and it was on-camera promise to the Kaiser community that we would do everything that we possibly could to protect their privacy. Because we were fully going electronic. Electronic medical records certainly knew everything about you, and your health history is unique. When someone actually penetrates those systems and steals that, they own that forever. It's for the rest of your life. So there's a real responsibility in healthcare to go above and beyond from a protection standpoint. That's not to say everyone's doing it perfectly or flawlessly today, but the need to spend more money on it, the need to use modern tools, AI, cloud, and other capabilities in an advanced way from a security standpoint is there and is critical that the whole industry takes up that responsibility. That said, I always felt it was my obligation as the CIO, and it was the CEO's obligation to not only promise but deliver. And we had to put our money where our mouth was. We, more than quadrupled the monies we were spending during my tenure at Kaiser, and even my next organization, we did the same. Security has taken up a large piece of the budget, but it's also the modern toolkit, I believe, actually will allow us to not continue that growth rate in spending and deliver even a more effective set of security capabilities that protect people's privacy.
So this is not the first time you've been in an industry that has to be focused on developing and becoming an early adopter of the cutting edge technologies, right? Your career started in financial services, which for a long time had the wonderful reputation of being the early adopters of technologies because they had this big thing called legacy systems. I think you're probably at another crossroads of when in financial services, the legacy systems that potentially currently existed even before the 90s that got changed out in the 90s probably need to maybe be refreshed again. Tell us a little bit about that trail, because you came up through financial services, you had that wonderful stint in healthcare, and then you just retired out of financial services, CIO, a position that the company actually created specifically for you, is my understanding.
I don't know that they created it for me, but the position was the first of a kind in the company, and the company was almost 100 years old. It was the global CIO for a very large insurance company. And effectively, when I looked at the whole financial services industry, and I did grow up in financial services, so I had a sense of pride about what we were doing 20 years ago. Coming back to it, I was very disturbed by what I'd found. And it's not just at the firm I worked in, but the entire industry, having gone through the last decade of crisis and having to really dig out of that crisis, is now in a position where the legacy in most financial services companies is quite abundant. Some companies, the systems are as old as 40 years. And when you're faced with that challenge as a CIO in any company, you truly want to go as fast as you can to change those systems out. But you have to also be mindful, particularly in public companies, of how you're going to make that into a return for the shareholder, and also satisfy all your constituents, and then satisfy your obligation as a shepherd of the company to ensure that the company is sustainable on a long-term basis. And balancing all of those elements when you're making decisions like that about a company with 40-year-old technology is extraordinarily challenging. Your question a moment ago about security, the need to really protect systems that didn't envision the world we're living in today, is an overwhelming challenge, and really building the kind of security capabilities to protect 40-year-old systems along the side of modern systems is a unique set of issues that I think the financial services industry as a whole, the insurance industry in particular, has to deal with.
Well, we can't really get into talking about financial services without talking about the big elephant in the room right now, Bitcoin, the cryptocurrencies, and the technology that I actually appreciate a lot more, the blockchain technology. Where is financial services vis-a-vis the cryptocurrencies, the Bitcoins that are out there? Is that truly a disruptor? Is that around to stay? Are they at some point going to be able to adopt cryptocurrency on their own traditional platforms?
Well, I'd say two things about that. One, I'm not an expert, so I'll guide with that or lean in with that. Cryptocurrency, I mean, is new and interesting and certainly has been volatile. I think a lot of us have seen the volatility. Equally, we've seen some of the heads of some pretty substantial financial institutions come out and say that they're not that interested in the cryptocurrency space, that they haven't said the same about blockchain as a technology. And I know for a fact there's a good deal of investment being made across financial services in the potential capabilities that blockchain, it's now a promise. It's up to the industry to engage with it and then ultimately either fulfill the promise or determine that that's an empty promise. In terms of the overall and overarching capability that's in blockchain. Blockchain in insurance, we were specifically looking at it when you think about title insurance.
Right.
And the title insurance industry can be completely disrupted by what blockchain brings to the fore. There are other parts of the industry where you can actually look at blockchain and say, yes, it's the right technology for the right problem. Like any technology, it's answering that question. What's the right problem? It is, so it's a technology that's interesting. The industry is still learning about it, still developing capabilities to leverage it, and still trying to determine where it plugs in.
How do you go about determining your technology? So you've now moved into being a strategic advisor to several of the well-known venture funds, both in Palo Alto and nationally located. You sit on the board of advisors and board of directors of several startup technology companies, cutting-edge technology companies. How do you decide where you're going to place your bets, right? And you have both in terms of capital investment, but more importantly, the more precious of your assets is your time. How do you actually decide where you're going to spend your time? Because you're in demand.
Well, I do spend time and have spent time for years and years in the startup space, and did that even when I was a CIO in a large company. I made time for the Silicon Valley community and the investment community in that space because what they were doing was going to be tomorrow's solutions. Yeah. And I wanted to have a sense of that as I was planning the path for the companies I was associated with as one of the leaders. But today, one of the great things about being a CIO of a decade, there's a lot of problems you're faced with that just don't have solutions. Particularly in the blend of systems that you deal with in the corporate world, where even something as simple as passwords and being able to solve that. And when phones first came out, I looked at my team, and I had great engineering teams, and said, okay, my phone knows me. Why do you need anything else? Right. So there's so many ways to ultimately solve the security problem there. When I think about the companies I'm getting involved with, I'm tending to get involved with companies that are solving problems that I was faced with as a decision maker and CIO over this past decade that had no solution. Yeah. And I think now that we're in this new age of technology between cloud and AI and some of the other toolkits that are out there around analytics, the world is about to change again, and these particular tools are making the solutions possible. And after a decade of wanting to solve something, I tend to gravitate toward companies that are solving the problems I had in the roles I've had in the past, and then basically giving my time and spending time with them, because I know the solutions they're going to come up with. As a CIO, I would buy, and as a leader in industry, I would buy because they will change the art of the possible for the companies that are out there, either from a service perspective, or from a privacy perspective, or from a product perspective. So when you think about those things, those are truly fundamental change that's coming to every business, specifically the industries I've been in, healthcare and financial services. the changes are going to be substantial.
Mm-hmm.
And the technologies I'm seeing are making me extremely optimistic about being able to solve some of these problems.
Oh, that's great. That's great. I think that that would make you a valuable advisor to those companies too. The user perspective, but also the understanding of how that technology needs to interact with the rest of what exists at a company, because it's almost unrealistic to expect. You know, it used to be when some of the big systems came out, they would say, well, you need to throw away your current legacy systems and install all of this. And it's like, that's just not practical for large organizations. It's not practical for anybody.
Well, it's
Yeah.
given the install base and the amount of money that organizations have spent over the years, usually it's 2 to 3 times to maintain a system versus implementing.
Yeah.
They've spent a fortune on that, and it's such a, you can look at it and say it's a sunk cost, let's move on,
Yeah.
but it's unrealistic in a real world where you have to deliver the next quarterly result.
Yes.
And systems that can solve big problems in the current world, that's a real world, make a real difference.
What do you think of the disruptions that are coming into financial services with the fintechs that will take away 25% of their traditional business?
You know, I think it's the whole disruption conversation, and it has been I've participated in that conversation for almost 40 years.
Yeah.
So that makes me a little older and now hopefully a lot wiser. The reality is that, you know, there's been innovation happening outside of the major institutions for decades. The value that brings is entirely new way of thinking. And many of these major institutions have been around for 100 years.
Right.
And there's a reason they've been around for 100 years, because they've been capable of adapting and adopting. And their ability to adopt those technologies because of their scale, which gives them time, it tends to buy them time. It doesn't buy them absolution from the changes that are coming, but they, you know, the burden they have is, how do we pivot our business to take advantage of these innovations and then leverage them into our core? And it's a consistent integration problem of leveraging new technologies while they sustain their old business, and then their business model spinning into an entirely new business model, which is, you know, it's an artful dance that happens in major corporations in terms of how they have to leverage these innovations. But I've lived through decades of you're going to go out of business because these little companies are going to completely, you know, dominate and take your business away. While that happens sometimes, you know, Amazon being an example, in the banking world, financial services, insurance, there's an element of trust that we all have in the major financial institutions that must be present for us to do business with these new technologies. There are some startups that are promising, and you know, with a new generation, millennials and younger, coming up in an economy and in a world where sharing occurs and where they're used to having the information out there, you know, older institutions may have a different meaning.
Right.
And some of these firms will take some business, but the older institutions have scale and resources. And I would never underestimate the benefit that scale and resource brings.
Right.
With, you know, leadership that is actually thinking ahead and being willing to take the business through change.